very interested in, since there were two, it seems, separate societies, black and white, what white people thought about black people. And you can go back into the 30s and the 40s, but up into the 50s, if you could, just give me a sense of what did they think they were unfairly treated? Did they think that they should be treated differently? Did they think that black people were inferior? What data is there on what people felt about what white people felt?
Our first real evidence is from the early 1940s, and at that point, segregation was accepted by most white Americans. It wasn't questioned at all. Segregation of schools, not only segregation but discrimination, what we would now call discrimination in employment. The majority of white Americans believed that white people should have the first opportunity to get a job, for example, and that blacks should be behind them. Now it's probably even more extreme in the 30s. We don't have detailed evidence there, but signs saying no blacks, no Jews, no minorities of any kind were openly displayed and very widely accepted. Sometime during the 1940s, probably, and we don't know exactly why and we don't know exactly when, it's clearest at the end of World War II, there began to be changes, and they were changes, as I say, toward all minorities. It was not only changes in white attitudes toward blacks. And the changes began with the rejection of discrimination and gradually the rejection of segregation, legal segregation in schooling. And that began in the early 40s, so far as we can tell, and has continued right up until today. So far as we can see, even today, despite what one hears about disturbances on college campuses and other kinds of even violence in some cases, white attitudes have continued to change in what would be considered a positive direction toward blacks and, as I say, toward other minorities.
Have you done any data, or is there any data, on what black people felt in the 50s? Did they have attitudes that were...
Well, in fact, the clearest change occurs in the 60s. Blacks, we don't have much evidence on the early 50s. If one looks at what was happening during the beginning of the civil rights movement, which was the late 50s, and it reached its peak in the early mid-60s, black attitudes were very hopeful, responded to the changes, the Supreme Court decision, set of decisions, and the apparent changes in white attitudes. And black attitudes were, one might say, conservative in the sense that there was a real eagerness for integration. Conservatives may seem like a strange word now, but real eagerness for integration, increasing probably trust in whites up until the mid-60s. There is a very interesting combination of two events that occurred in 1965. In August 1965, early August, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which was one of the major civil rights accomplishments and pushed very hard by Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, and passed by Congress with Lyndon Johnson's support. That was in early August 1965. A week later, the Watts riot occurred, which was the first of the major riots that we associated with the late 1960s. So one had a sense of real progress in terms of what whites were doing, and yet apparently underneath increasing dissatisfaction on the part of blacks, because perhaps partly rising aspirations, no doubt also because voting rights and some of the other things that were done by Congress were not really affecting blacks, especially blacks in major cities, in the inner cities, working class, lower class blacks. And so what we had really was an explosion, first in Watts and then later in most other major American cities, and evidence of increasing black disenchantment with whites, with the slow pace of desegregation, with the absence of much change economically.
Has that dissatisfaction continued?
We think that that the sharp rise coincided with the riots of the late 60s, and those both reflected the dissatisfaction and increased the dissatisfaction. We don't have a lot of evidence that it has continued to rise, but has certainly not returned to the kind of trust and hopefulness that was true of the early 60s during the time of maximum civil rights demonstration, maximum change in Congress, through Congress, and so forth. So you have white attitudes going like this, black attitudes probably going more like that.